Once upon a time, a boy was born in the dark, distant, backwards place of Birmingham. And when he was born, the midwives took a look at this child and how energetic it was, and they warned the mother that this was a twice-born child. A person who had already lived out a life and died and come back for one more adventure. And if you looked at those energetic little legs, they were just set for running. And as soon as they could, the boy would go. He'd find his adventures and the mother would never see him again. So heeding the prophecy of the midwife, that mother took her babe and climbed aboard a double-decker bus and drove all the way out, over the hills, to where her parents lived, where the child grew up penned in and away from the world by the trees and the high hills and by the stories the grandparents told him to keep him from running away. "Don't go into the trees," they said. "Darkness and death awaits you there, and even if you got past it, even if you were fast enough in the caves, there is a giant." And sometimes you can hear him stomping his footsteps all over the hills. And it was true. Sometimes the boy, as he grew up, could hear the stomps of a giant on the hills, and he was afraid. And they told him more. They said that even if he escaped the giant, the hills themselves were actually a dragon, and should he walk upon its back, he would tickle the dragon and it would take off and fly him straight to hell. But boys grow up fast. And this young boy grew up fast on his feet, thinking somewhere along the way that if he could be quick enough, he could outrun all these dangers and go out into the world beyond and have an adventure. But each day after running, he'd come by, as his grandmother taught him, and drink from the Evendene brook, and then give an offering over to the yew tree at the bottom. And when he did so, a skylark would always come out of the trees and flit and sing its song above him, and then fly off to the trees again, and return as though it was inviting him into the trees, but the boy didn't feel like he was fast enough. And so he ran and ran all he could, so that when the US Army trucks drove by, he'd run alongside the truck as fast as he could, with the men throwing out biscuits and cheering him on. And when the baker came casting out loaves, the boy would catch them as he ran beside the van. By the time he grew fast enough to outrun the Meals on Wheels bicycle, his grandparents told him another story. They said that beyond the hills, the world was war-torn and dangerous and dark, and he shouldn't go there. And so he didn't try until he was old enough and brave enough and brash enough to run as fast as he could into the trees. And he ran with all his speed past the brooks, past the stones and past the trees until, bash! He crashed into something dark and landed on his bum, and looking up in front of him was a great crow, as tall as a burnt tree, black feet, black feathers, black beak, black eyes. It spoke into his mind and said, "I am the gatekeeper to the other world. I pass between this life and the next, and I will come to take you there one day." And the boy, even in his fear, he put two and two together and said, "One day? You mean I'm not going to die today?" "No," said the crow in his mind again. "You will be old and white as I am black before you die." "Oh," said the boy, finding strange comfort in that. And then he asked, "What will it be like?" And the crow said, "Look into my eyes." And the boy looked into those dark obsidian eyes and knew that he was part of the earth and part of the sky and part of the stars and the galaxies beyond, and one with everything, so that when he came back to himself, it was with a scream that burst feathers that fell to the ground. And where they landed, there was a crow by each one, who picked up a feather and brought it to his feet. And one of the crows wove together some black feather slippers, and all the crows together looked up towards the cave, and he knew that they were saying that he should face his fears therein. And so he slipped on those black slippers, and found that as he ran, his footfall was silent as could be, and in no time at all he was standing below the cliff face where the cave was, and there on the ground was the rock that he'd heard in his grandparents' stories, the doorway to the cave that the giant had hurled its body against and pressed out so that it fell down below to the ground. And when the boy looked at the shape of the body that had pressed into the rock, he lay down in its form, and he realized that it wasn't much bigger than him, and he had the first inkling that perhaps the giant wasn't so big after all. And then he stepped silently away, finding steps on the cliff face that led up to the cave. And when he saw the steps and realized they were narrow enough to climb, he thought again that the giant couldn't possibly be so big. And by the time he got to the entrance of the cave and saw that it was small enough for only a man to walk through, he knew now that there was no giant at all. And he stepped into that small cave. And realizing that all the stories he'd been told, some of them might have been true, but this one certainly wasn't, and he screamed in his rage, and as he shouted, the cave reverberated again and again with the sound of his voice, and he heard in it the sound of a giant, and he realized there and then that there were giants. And the giants were the ones with the voices loud enough to tell you where to go and where you couldn't go. And he wouldn't put up with them any longer. And then he laughed. He suddenly felt free. He boomed with laughter. And as he did so, it reverberated around him. And he looked down at his feet. And he saw that the cave floor was smooth in some parts, as though it had been stamped upon by feet. And so he did that himself. He stomped and stomped and stomped, and hearing the echoes reverberate out of the cave, he knew that that had been the sound of the giant all along. And now he stepped out of the cave, and he walked up the high hills, not worried at all whether there would be a dragon there or not, and down into Great Malvern, where there was not a war-torn world at all. There was just a town full of people, bustling marketplaces, shops, people going to and fro their business like he'd always thought there would be. And then he found himself outside the cinema. And he asked the lady, "What is this place? What are these pictures about?" And she said, "Well, it's the pictures, darling. You know, the movies." He said, the movies? And she explained what they were about. And so he decided he'd go and watch. But she stopped him and said, "You have to pay, darling." Oh, how do I pay?" he said. And she said, "Well, with buttons, sir." And so he looked down at his shirt and he pulled off one button and he handed it over and he stepped into the cinema. And he watched Godzilla. And it wasn't how impressive the monster was and how much it seemed like the stories he'd been told. It was Osaka. Another city, another place, the idea of a world beyond his own that excited him, so that when he came out of the cinema, he ran out and he sat down on a bench and he boldly spoke to the blonde lady who was sitting there. Actually, she was a girl with long hair, just the same age as him, and as he looked at her, he thought she was quite beautiful, but was still bursting out with all that he'd thought about the world and how he'd been held back and how he longed for adventure, until he let her speak, and she said she longed for adventure too. And she felt cooped up and penned in. And he said how he was the same and how he'd been held back and he wasn't afraid anymore. And then he looked down at her legs and realized why she was saying it. She had braces upon her legs, and she explained at his look that she had rheumatic fever, and her mother had brought her up all the way from the south near London so that they could be near Droitwich Spa and she could soak in the brine baths there so that she could overcome her illness. And she longed for that day, and in the meantime she felt like her mother was fattening her up like the pigs they had on the small holding. And then she said, "Well, it's not that true. I think my mother worries for me. I think she sees how skinny I am and she wants me to be well. But it's like," she said, "like the ducks." "The ducks," he said. And then she told him how there were ducks that they had on their small holding, and the chickens would lay eggs, never in the pen, she said, all over the farm. And when the ducks laid eggs by the pond, the ducks would sit on those eggs. And sometimes they'd climb off those eggs to watch them hatch, and then they'd go into the water thinking that the chicks would trail after them and swim, but the chicks instinctively knew that they weren't ducks, and they'd wait on the side, and the duck would have a look in its eye that said, I must have sat on somebody else's eggs." And that's how she felt, like her mother in her eyes was saying that she was someone else's egg, and she longed to be free from that pitying look. And so the boy said to her, I'll take you on an adventure. I promise you I will." And he looked at her, and he found, just like in stories, he'd fallen quite in love with her. When her bus came to take her away, he watched her go, and then he flew back over the hills and home again. And the next day he longed to return to see her, but when he looked up at the Worcester beacon, he saw that it was lit, which meant only one thing. Invaders. War had come to their shores, and even though he was too young to be drafted into the army, he was made an assistant, an apprentice, watching out and overseeing factories that made munitions for the war efforts. And he was so good at his job that it wasn't long before he was sent away, off to munitions factories around the world on the war front. And at first he was proud, thinking that was quite an achievement for such a young man, but then he realized that he had lined himself right in the target of the bombs. But in his fear, he remembered what the crow had said, that he wouldn't die until his hair was white as the crow's feathers were black. And so he wasn't afraid anymore. But everywhere he went, he realized it was taking him further from that girl who he hoped was waiting for him at home. And everywhere he went, it reminded him of home. So that when he found himself out inspecting the dodgiest factory he'd ever found out in the Ural Mountains, he climbed to one of the peaks, and seeing a buzzard call its great cry, he remembered what she'd said about the hills back home, that if you stood at the Worcester beacon, the next highest peak would be the Ural Mountains where now he stood, and he longed for her. Then in Yemen, where the men who worked in the factory insisted on carrying their jambias, those daggers in front of their chests, and insisted too on firing their guns in the air, he missed her even more and longed for home, where she said out there in the fields the men would do the rabbit run. They'd shoot their guns in the air and the rabbits would come out, and the children would run after them. Be careful to be noisy so that they wouldn't be mistaken for rabbits. And he chuckled over the story. Next, he was out in India, in a particularly difficult situation where the Indian workers did not trust the British soldiers, and it was so tough that he couldn't get them to do the job they needed to do. And taking a walk one day to think it over, he found himself at the Taj Mahal, and as he passed through one of the arches, he heard the low hum and buzz of bees, and looking there at the top of the arch, he saw a beehive, full and fat and dripping with honey. And it made him think of the things she'd said, how she talked about the bees at home and how you had to love them and they would love you back, how together they'd work as one united group, and you couldn't believe what they could accomplish, how much honey they could make. And he went back to the factory and he sat down with the workers and he told those Indian folks that he was sorry. He needed to trust them and to love them, and that's what he did. One of the workers loved him like a brother and stuck by his side even when he left that country and went on to other munitions factories until the war began to wind down to a close and they found themselves in Germany at a factory in one last push. But the SS were pushing back too and sent their bombers over, and one of those bombs came and landed right down on the factory where he was working, and as he was dragged away by his Indian brother, he saw the bodies of his friends strewn around, and he was struck blind with the shock of it all. He didn't even get to say goodbye to his friend. He was sent off home and found himself in a hospital in Malvern. On the first day he was there, the woman he'd longed for, now truly a woman, took his hand, and the moment she did so, the scales fell from his eyes and he looked at her. And she was more beautiful than he remembered, and more so, she was standing on her own legs without any braces. And she smiled and she said, "You know, I've been working now." And he said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, I've been a comp operator." A what operator?" he said. A comptometer operator. She said, they're calculating machines, and we work out accounts, and I've been earning really well. "You've been earning?" he said. "Your own buttons?" "Yes," she said, "but I wasn't paid at first." "What? You weren't paid?" he said, and he stood up out of his bed. "I'll see to that." She said, No, at first I wasn't paid, but then I went down to the river and I cried because they weren't paying me. Mother said I should just work for work, but then I remembered what you said about giants. having big voices, and so I went back to the office and I said in a loud voice, "You will pay me exactly what you owe me." And they were so afraid. They paid me all that they owed me over the last 2 years, and I even bought a car. He looked at her and she said, "Well, I'm a very independent woman now." And with that, he dropped to his knee and he said, "Would you marry me?" She said yes, and he scooped her up in his arms, walked her down the hospital passageway and into the chapel. Right there, he married her. And he did exactly what he'd said that day on that bench, so long ago it seemed. He took her on an adventure. They went off to honeymoon in Nairobi, where they stayed in a tree house, where there were signs saying, "Don't leave stuff around or the monkeys will get them." And they saw the giraffes walking past, and in the great hall where the food was served, there was a condiment train that came whizzing by, and it seemed like a dream that they were living together, where they went from adventure to adventure, swimming with sharks, stealing pearls from giant oysters, shooting pheasants, riding on horseback over hedges, and living out their lives, and even having children and taking them abroad with them. Once upon a time, they visited the Taj Mahal, saw a beehive there, and talked about love, and knew that it was lost on their first son because he was ill, and he died before his time. And as they mourned, she remembered. She remembered how he had said that death was just a doorway, that there was an adventure beyond, and somehow it helped. And then the second son, when he went on to get rich and never spoke to them anymore, she remembered that sometimes you don't sit on your own eggs. And their third son, well, he was obstinate and he was difficult, but they loved him so much more stubbornly, until he loved them back and became a dear son and was with them all the days. And when his father finally passed away, his mind having gone long before into the past adventures, soon after his mother died too, and she had lived out the last of her days in a dream, in the adventure of her past with her husband, so that when she died, there in front of her was Crow. Dark feet, dark feathers, dark beak, dark eyes. He pushed forward 2 black feather slippers to her. She slipped them on, and with the crow she walked up to the top of the mountain. And at the beacon there was her love waiting for her. He stepped down and took off her feather slippers and kissed her feet, and kissed her knees, and kissed her navel, and kissed her lips, and then he said, "Let's dance!" And they didn't dance gently in death, but stomping their feet all over the back of that dragon, which lifted its tail up from the ground, shaking the trees and the rocks off, and lifted its head, shaking the town loose, and then unfurling its great wings, it lifted up and soared into the sky, taking them to their next great adventure.